Welcome to our Cybersecurity Awareness Month education session. My name is Ryan Smith. I'm president of RLS Consulting, and I'll be taking you through a walkthrough of various topics throughout the month of October as we look at different things you can learn more about security awareness for yourself at home and for help with the office. Today's topic, we're going to dig into simple ways to understand cyber risks. And as we do that, I'm going to introduce you to a risk equation that's going to help give us a framework to follow, as well as the CIA triad of cybersecurity, because this gives us some different things that we can start to understand about our risks and how it might impact us. I'll also talk about the flow of information so we can start to think about the different areas where risks might exist. And then we'll talk about some of the things to think about when we're looking at areas of cyber risk that we have either in our personal use at home or at work. So let's first start with our risk equation. And this comes from risk-based cybersecurity. It basically tells us ways to start to break down a risk based on two key factors, the likelihood and impacts related to our areas of risk. Now, likelihood has to do more with the probability related to a cyber incident occurring. And when we think about the factors that attribute to likelihood, we want to think about how this type of an event could occur. And this really depends on the vulnerabilities or weaknesses in our environment, and is somewhat combined too with the types of threats that we have to think about too as we consider those vulnerabilities that are out there. The next part of the equation is really about the impact part. And so this is more of what happens if we have an attack, and it could give us an idea of what might really happen if there's costs or other types of things that we don't want to happen. And that's where that CIA triad of cybersecurity comes in. And the CIA triad stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So it gives us some really simple ways to think about how we use technology, and because of our use of it, how to think about what might happen if things go wrong. So we'll break into that all in just a moment. First, let's start with likelihood. As I mentioned before, likelihood is based on vulnerabilities or weaknesses in our environment. And this could really be any place in our environment. So we have to think about any place where these vulnerabilities lie. We're going to talk about the flow of information in a little bit, and this will give us some places to start to look at and think about. But it does have to do with typically a piece of technology. It could be a device. It could be a process that we're following. It could be a different system that we're using. Maybe it's an application or a piece of software, or it could even be an individual. So when we think about what makes it more or less likely for us to be attacked, and we're looking at really the staff side of things, we're thinking about security awareness, this is really where it's important for us to think about these areas where we have weaknesses or vulnerabilities. Now, when an attacker takes advantage of one of those weaknesses and it leads them to a compromise, we call that an exploit. So if you hear that terminology, that's what we're thinking about here, and that's what we're watching out for. We want to be proactive, so we're looking for those areas of vulnerabilities that could become exploited. So there are a few things that we want to think about when it comes to likelihood factors that really would determine whether we have a high likelihood or probability of something happening or if it's lower. The first one really comes down to how easy it is to detect that this vulnerability or weakness exists. Is it something that somebody can just use a tool to scan across different environments and be able to find that there's a weakness there? Or is it something that people can just kind of assume? Because obviously, if we're talking to a person, maybe that person can be tricked. So is it easy to tell that there's an individual that we're going to be interacting with? Or is there some other type of way for us to detect this? So a simple way to think about this too is like going through a parking lot checking car door handles. It's really easy to tell which ones might be unlocked. So in a similar sense, we need to think about this area of risk, from a technology perspective. Where are those vulnerabilities that are really easy for somebody to detect? Next, we have to think about how easy it is to exploit them. So if somebody can find them, that's one part, but do they know what to do with this? Is this something where you need a sophisticated hacker and advanced skill sets to be able to exploit it? Or is it something that really is as simple as tricking a person that really maybe anybody could do? And so the level of difficulty around these vulnerabilities or weaknesses as far as exploitations go is another factor we need to weigh. The other part is, are people even looking for it to begin with? Is this something that the larger threat community is aware of? Or is this something that's really unique and significant, really only to your business? So we have to think about those different situations, because obviously when more people are looking for it and it's something that attackers know is also easy to detect and easy to attack, it's probably something that they're definitely going to be hitting. So those ones that people are really aware of that are showing up in the news and things like that are things that we really need to keep in mind. And then really more on the protection side of things, what are we doing to tell us if this weakness is being exploited? Is there anything that can stop somebody, make it harder maybe for them to get into it? Or are there different things that can alert us at least to take action if we need to? So the level of protection around these areas of weaknesses, these chinks in our armor, we need to kind of think about. What's important to note with all of this kind of stuff, and this is where people can run into problems, is that there's always unknowns and there's always new vulnerabilities. A system might get an update to where now there's a new flaw in it, or maybe it's a new feature that was turned on, and attackers are able to manipulate it and use it in ways that it probably wasn't supposed to be used to cause some kind of mayhem or problem. So in these different situations, sometimes we don't know about these things until there have been cyber attacks, and now we know to go look for them. Now we know it was easy for somebody to find, and now they're aware of it and they're looking for it, and they're actually finding easy ways to attack it. That's going to raise some alarms for us for something that really needs some attention. So as we think about things, we're going to get into more of a way to look at this across the flow of information in a moment. But we really need to think about these four different factors. Is it easy to detect? Is it easy to attack? And are people looking for it? And then what protections are there that maybe we can turn on? And so these are things that can really help us understand if something's a high probable attack vector or if it's a lower probability. So the next part of the equation gets into impact. And so this is really regardless of the likelihood, regardless of how somebody might get in, we need to think about what's at stake if an attack happens. And this comes down to how we use our technology. So there's a couple ways that we categorize this. Using the CIA triad of cybersecurity makes it really simple for us to be able to figure out ways to understand how we might have an impact. And it just has to do with how we use our technology. So the first part has to do with confidentiality. This is privacy. So what information do we have in our systems or maybe that we know that needs to stay private? What are these things that we can do to protect that information as we go through that? But as we have sensitive information, or maybe it's personal information, could be financial, could be intellectual property, anything that's not supposed to be public, we need to think about what we're able to do to keep it private. And more so on the impact side of this, what happens if it gets out? Is this something that's okay because it's already public information, or is this something that's going to cause some problems? So we need to think about that level of confidentiality we need to maintain. Next is the integrity or trust within our technology, our processes, our environment, whatever it might be. We need to think about where trust falls in. So what are we relying on being accurate that if somebody were to get access to our environment could manipulate and cause problems? Are we making decisions based on information? Are we assuming a communication's coming from a particular person because that's what it says, but somebody's manipulated it and now we can't trust it because it's had an attack? The integrity part to me is really tricky because it's hard to tell if you've had an attack in some cases, and so you might not know if the trust is gone. And so we need to think about this within the technology we use is where's trust? How is it a factor in here? And what things can we do to maintain that? What can we do to validate that something's actually accurate? The next part is availability. And this might make a little bit more sense for people too as they start to think about areas of attack. And you think about ransomware, is what is the technology we're relying on? And what happens when it's not there when we need it? Now, this could be as simple as your phone dying and you thinking about what you're going to have to do to reach out to people that are, or maybe people are trying to reach you. It could also be something like a device that's been encrypted with malware, like a ransomware attack, where now you can't use that. Now, for a business, obviously, this is going to have big impacts on you because you have costs of operations, you can have downtime and things like that that can affect you in different ways. On a personal level, obviously, there's a lot of inconveniences when you have a piece of technology that you're really dependent on being available for you when you need it. And so these are the three key areas we can think about. Now, for simplicity, we're keeping it just to these three. There are, of course, other things that can happen to increase the impact and the cost after a data breach. So, for example, you might have fines, you might have response actions that you need to take, you might have to restore information, repair things. You might have other legal costs or costs of loss of reputation or loss of business. So there's other factors that come into business with this, but these are three really easy ways that we can start to think about where privacy, trust, and reliability fit into our business. And that CIA triad is really easy to remember and just helps us kind of stay focused on those key things that, again, just depend on how we're using technology in our business or in our personal lives. So now let's look at how we can apply these factors related to likelihood and impact as we think about the flow of information. And so this is based off of the cyber defense matrix if you're interested in learning more about things, but it's basically thinking about how information goes from us as individuals to whatever end destination that we're accessing. So first you have the person that's involved here. As the person connects, they get on a device, whether it's a mobile phone, laptop, computer in your office, whatever it might be. That device is the means then to how they're connecting to the internet using a network. The network could be your office network, it could be your home, it could be a wireless network if you're using mobile data, or it could be a public Wi-Fi. However, we're getting to the internet and whatever channels we're using through there, that network's going to play a factor in it. And then we have the end destination. So we're obviously getting online to go do something. It might be going to a website. It might be opening up another application. Maybe we have shared files or storage or other data points where we're getting access to things. So it can really be a lot of different things at that end destination. But across each of these, we need to think about the risks that lie at those different areas. So just jumping back a little bit with the person, this is where it's really important to think about things like situational awareness. So, is there something that maybe you know that you need to protect? So, thinking about confidentiality here, is there something that somebody could overhear you saying that needs to stay private? Or could you be interacting with somebody that's maybe had a compromise of trust? Somebody's had an email attack and now you're corresponding with an attacker when you thought it was somebody you trusted. So are you sharing information to that person that now needs to stay private? So think about the risks that you have as an individual. And usually this goes again around situational awareness, making sure that you're aware of who can hear what you're talking about, who can see your computer screen, see what you're typing, or if you're disclosing or having conversation with somebody, what information is being shared there. The next part being the device, we need to start to think about the protections around the tools that we're using. So if you have a work computer, you probably already have things like antivirus turned on. It probably has security patches and updates. But if we're using a device that's maybe not provided by the office, it might not have the same levels of protection. So we need to start to think about the things that we can do to secure what's on that device and the information that's there. This is where data encryption and things like that can become really important. But we need to think about the things that are there, and if that device becomes compromised, what that could then have access to. Because in some cases, when we connect to different things, we're trusting that that person using that device is supposed to be you. So do we have extra steps in place that can make sure if somebody else gets into that device that it's safe? The next part would be your networks. And this, again, is that form of traffic, basically, that's moving from your device to the internet. So it's how you're connecting to all of these things. You have information going both directions. Now, if you're not in a secure network, there are situations where somebody could be sitting on that network intercepting information. And so that's why it's really important to make sure that you're not using things like coffee shop Wi-Fi or airport or hotel Wi-Fi, especially anything that's free or guest access, because any of those public networks could have anybody out there sitting on that network. And depending on the security protocols that are in place, they could be intercepting your information, especially if you're getting on that network to share something sensitive. So in most cases, it's always safest to be using a secure office network. If you have to use a mobile network, that's going to be a lot more secure. Even at home, we have to think about how we're securing our home networks because in a lot of cases, we might just have routers that were given from our cable company and they might not have a lot of security in place. And we have to think about who else is using that network. So if we have kids in the other room accessing online content, downloading games or whatever, these are things that can open up risks to the rest of the people connected to that network. Now, if you do ever have to connect to a public network, one thing that you can do is also use VPN or a virtual private network to help shield some of the things that are happening there. But it's really important, again, just to think about the risks within the network that you're using, because again, somebody could be intercepting that. The last part comes down to the things that you're accessing. And a lot of it really on this side is going to be determined by the level of security that you can put into those tools. So let's just use, for example, on a personal basis, your bank account. So you could set up a strong password and multi-factor authentication to make sure that's really just you that's getting into that. And then as we think about other tools and things that we use, we want to have those same levels of concern. So when we think about things that are likely to be attacked or the different high impacts and things like that, because of the nature of whatever that application might be, we want to think about the different levels of security that we can apply to it to make sure that we're actually protecting that. So all of this flow of information is really important to think about as we go through that we need to think about where risks lie within each of those. And so it's a combination, again, as we think about risks with the systems, the devices, the technology in general, the processes around it, and even the people involved. So that's where we can start to really kind of look at this flow of information. It's just a simple way to kind of start to break it down. So with that all in mind, let's take a moment to kind of think back at this. Now, as we look at risks that we might have at home and at work, we want to look for these areas where these key factors really apply. So first, where is likelihood something that we need to really be thinking about? So where are we more vulnerable or where do we have these weaknesses? And remember, there were a couple key factors that attribute to this. What's easy to detect, what's easy to attack, what are attackers aware of, and where maybe are we missing some protections, or where could we put protections in place? And so these are the different things that can attribute to areas of risk. So where are the high likelihood areas that you need to be thinking about? And then when we start to think about the impact, where are the areas where we have a high level of confidentiality, integrity, and availability that we need to maintain? Where's that privacy, trust, and reliability fit for us? Where are the areas that it's most important to have these things? And we might have things like our email account where it checks several of those boxes. There's probably sensitive information in there. There's certainly communication tools we need to make sure we can trust what's going back and forth through it. And we're probably dependent on it. There's probably a lot of availability risk. So as we look at the different pieces of technology and we look at those different things in that flow of information, where does that CIA triad have a high weight with the risk? So as you think about that, look at this at home and look at this at work. Where are your biggest area of risks based on these key factors? In the next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about things that you can do to start to protect them, but this is a good place to really start thinking about simple ways to understand your cyber risk.